Our call is meeting to order. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, so we have our minutes from our previous meeting of 2 weeks ago. We had a discussion and public hearing of the Judson Farm subdivision, and that was open and closed, and the resolution granting preliminary layout and final subdivision plat approval for the Judson Farm subdivision. Okay. Which was approved.
Did I forget to put you there?
Then we had the
Sure.
dual Hamel handler, lot line adjustment, open and close that public hearing. That resolution granting preliminary layout and final subdivision plat approval was approved. Then we had LWF LLC, Fortune Company, open and close the public hearing, resolution granting preliminary layout and final subdivision plat approval approved. And to old business, we had a brief discussion on NY Transco LLC, and that discussion continues tonight. Then we had a final discussion on 3185 Route 22, MCC Holdings LLC, and a resolution granting site plan approval. It was approved. And a new business for Sherman Hill Road, two-family. I had a discussion there that has site visits for planning board members and consultants coming up this and next Saturdays, and then that should continue at our next meeting. Then we went into executive session and came out of executive session, and we hired a geologist for the Transco project to advise the town, the planning board rather. Then we adjourned the meeting. Motion to accept the minutes of the November 20th planning board meeting. Motion made by Member Villano, seconded by Member Ledorbidier. Discussion? Seeing no discussion, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed say no. Okay, that motion passes 5-0 with 2 absences. All right, and now we're going to go to old business. So we have New York Transco Door Electric Substation. I'd like to come to the podium.
Evening.
Good evening. All right. So we received your information, and you're obviously here at the last meeting. You know that we hired geologists, and we're going to go through some stuff with our consultants now.
Okay.
Unless you had anything you wanted to say at this time?
Nope.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so tonight we have 2 new consultants at the table, as you can see. Scott Taylor is a private independent professional geologist, and Brian Zeroff, he works for AKRF. So we're going to start with Scott. Scott, if you could just introduce yourself.
Yeah, Scott Taylor, Tailored Environment. I've been in the industry of soil and groundwater remediation for 25 years. I am a professional, New York State licensed professional geologist, number 1088. I've been living in town of Dover for almost 20 years.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. And just got to put something out there right now. So you and I ran for public office together 12 years ago.
Correct.
Okay. And since then, we've had how many conversations, except for like the last week or two?
Possibly one.
Right, I thought one or maybe two at the carnival or something.
Right, at
Okay.
some function, correct.
So we're not best friends?
No,
Okay. We don't even really,
no.
okay. Just wanted to put that out there, just in case anybody thought there might be some conflict of interest that I hired my best friend. No. So, but just, be clear, we did run for public office 12 years ago together.
We did, and I
Just want to make
lost.
that clear. Do you think that in any way impacts what we're going to be doing here?
Not at all.
I didn't think so either. Okay. And Scott, you've previously worked for the town.
I have on many occasions,
Okay.
in my professional
Right.
capacity.
Okay. Can you tell us about your work up at the highway garage?
Yeah, so I directed the remediation of a leaking, I believe it was the gasoline pump that probably leaked for several years and created a extensive gasoline plume, and we successfully remediated that gasoline spill with closure from New York State Department of Environmental Conservation.
Okay. So you're certainly familiar with problems in the ground and have worked for the
Yeah,
town.
I would say I'm an expert in soil and groundwater remediation, solid waste, and recycling,
All right.
construction recycling.
And so there was clearly a problem up there, and you identified the problem, and in identifying the problem and trying to remediate it, you found that the problem was in fact much worse, right?
Well, right, the original remedial action did not address the the plume completely.
Okay.
So we had to investigate again to further delineate the plume, and then went back and finished the job some 2 or 3 years later.
Okay. Which,
Which
And
was
it-
successful in that the spill, we were able to remove all the the gasoline contaminated soil, and inevitably got spill closure from the New York State Department of
Right.
Environmental Conservation.
okay. So, and that ended up costing the taxpayers even more money and,
A lot more.
yeah,
It doubled it, the second iteration,
Right.
sure.
okay. So again, you've got no problem obviously telling the people who are paying you, like, here's a problem, guess what, the problem's even worse, we need to address this.
Right, well, we're following the DER 10, which is the guidance document that tells us how the DEC wants a site cleaned up.
Right,
And that's what guides what I do.
okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
And Brian, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your credentials?
Sure. My name is Brian Zeroff. I've been conducting environmental site assessments for going on 28 years. I work for AKRF. I'm a certified professional geologist by the American Institute of Professional Geologists. It's a national certification. I'm also a licensed environmental professional in the state of Connecticut.
Okay. And you work for AKRF, so part of the discussion is that the judge in this case is looking for the planning board to take the unusual step of doing our own soil sampling, and you are going to be heading it up on behalf of, or, as you work for AKRF, right?
Correct.
Okay. And Scott, you're going to be then peer reviewing the work that's done and making sure that AKRF is doing absolutely what they need to do. Well, AKRF and whoever they hire to do the work.
Yes.
Okay. And you and Brian, beyond last week,
Met for the first time.
right, okay. So again, not friends, not chums, not,
No, I don't think we've ever done any work on similar projects.
okay. This is in fact your first face-to-face meeting you've ever?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. You were just on Zoom last week. and that was-
One face-to-face one.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay, thank you. Okay, and, okay, so, thank you both. Just go through my notes here. So you both received Transco's submission, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Including the existing groundwater and soil testing data from the Phase 1 investigation. And as last week's Zoom meeting of myself and the consultants, we're preparing comments for the board, right?
Correct.
Okay. And it's, that. Okay. And these are your comments? Correct?
Yes,
Received
that's
today?
a memo.
Yep. Okay. So why don't you walk us through this memo? Usually this is something Planner Warner does, so either one of you, I guess.
Sure. Go ahead. I put together this memo to respond to a request from the town, and it was put together in a way where basically gave a background summary to lay the foundation of what needed to be talked about, and then went through the details of the site background, a summary of the environmental site assessments that were completed, the results of those assessments, specific issues identified by the court, and then put in an explanation in response to those issues.
Okay.
And that's the basic framework of the memo.
Okay.
And we can go into any section in detail if you wish.
All right. So again, we just received this memo today. We're going to digest it over the next
Okay.
2 weeks. And then we'll probably look to talk about it further,
Okay.
yeah, in 2 weeks.
Yeah, it's a lot of information, but
Sure. And
On with the SEOs tonight while he's
Yeah, maybe it makes sense to go to.
this will go up on the website
Tomorrow,
tomorrow.
probably.
Yeah, okay. Thank
Well,
you.
either tomorrow or Thursday, because I may not be in, I'm not going to be in
Well, this
Wednesday.
week. It'll go
Yeah.
up this week. Okay, thank you. Okay, and so you've outlined next steps.
Why don't we, maybe it makes sense to go through the issues raised by the court, because
Okay.
we have Brian prepared kind of responses to each one of the issues, and perhaps that would be productive for tonight.
Sure.
It starts on page 4.
With whether the planning board relied on the correct soil cleanup
Correct.
objective. Okay.
all right, so looked at this issue, which is whether the planning board relied on the correct soil cleanup objective, and put together kind of a long response, but the goal was to explain what the soil cleanup objectives are and how the state of New York uses them for cleaning up a site. And, in summary, the SCOs are not legally bound to sites that are not in a state cleanup program, whether that's, say, a volunteer program like the Brownfield Cleanup Program, or whether there's some sort of enforcement action, like a consent order, or they've listed an owner as a responsible party for, say, a state hazardous waste site. In that sense, in the process of going through the investigation and remediation, the state will identify what SCOs are applied. Since this particular site is not in a cleanup program, SCOs don't legally apply to it, but they are a good thing for us environmental professionals to use, because it does give a guideline as to how we should look at a site, when we should determine whether there are cleanup actions that are required and what the performance criteria would be to complete those cleanup actions.
Okay.
So in looking at the selection of, I'll kind of go through the typical SCOs. You have unrestricted use. It's the most rigorous SCO.
Right.
That's selected for, when you have a site use that ensures safety for all anticipated uses. There are no use restrictions.
Okay.
There are a set of protection of public health criteria that are based on a site use.
Mhm.
So say you have a property and you need to clean it up, and sometimes you can't just go in there and clean it up pristine to meet an unrestricted use criteria.
Mhm.
You'll have options based on your site use if you're in a state program to clean it up to a soil cleanup objective that is matched with that site use.
Okay.
Those are residential.
Right.
That's the most stringent of the protection of public health SCOs, and it can be used for scenarios where people live and are in contact with the soil, like a garden, your
Okay.
typical single-family residence. There's restricted residential. You'll see that for like apartments or condominiums, so there's just less of a chance of direct exposure to soil.
Mhm.
Then there's the commercial SCO, which usually correlates with sites with the use like businesses, retail stores, offices. It's basically, the state sees it as, it's an action that limits the potential for exposure to soil. Like if you're entering a retail center and purchasing some items and leaving, you're not there, toiling a garden.
Sure.
And then there's the industrial SCOs. They're the least stringent of the protection of public health. And that usually applies for like manufacturing, fabrication, and other similar uses where occupancy is typically limited to like a shift worker.
Mhm.
You come to the site, you work, and you go home. You have visitors and stuff, but and then so when you're in a state program and you're meeting one of these protection of public health criteria, you'll see institutional and engineering controls involved, where you might use your foundation as a way to prevent exposure to soil, or you might file an environmental easement which will limit the use to, say, retail stores or something.
Okay.
And that helps you achieve that soil cleanup objective. And then there's also the protection of groundwater SCOs, which is intended to prevent an exceedance of the state's ambient water quality standards. And then there's also protection of ecological resources. That's utilized by the state in a remediation program when ecological resources are confirmed to be or will be present when you've identified a release of contamination and the resulting contaminant plume is identified as a threat to those ecological resources.
Okay.
So, looking at selection of commercial SCOs, which correlates to something like a business, a retail store, an office, it seemed that selection of that, would be consistent with electrical substation.
Mhm.
One could even maybe say that that's more of an industrial use.
Mhm.
And so, as a consultant, if you know that SCOs don't apply to your site, but you want to select one that would be consistent with the intended use, the selection that was made was consistent with the definition of that.
Okay.
And but with the overall knowledge that it's not legally binding to the site.
Okay. And would you take into consideration the surrounding area off-site? Say if there's houses nearby or a swamp or things like that?
Well, it would take into consideration, because the protection of public health includes exposure to soil on that property.
Okay.
It's taken into consideration the use on that property, but it also, the uses are going to be correlated to what the area is zoned for.
Mhm.
It's typical of the fact that, you're going to have a consistent use.
Right. So this is zoned commercial, and it's a commercial operation that's being proposed. So what guideline would you say would be the most appropriate one to use? Again, noting as you did that it's not legally binding.
Yeah, it's a commercial use SEO is appropriate. But as a consultant, you can also take different paths voluntarily, basically, and say, I'm going to take a more conservative approach and use a more stringent SEO.
So that would be the restricted residential.
Yeah, you could say, okay, I'm going to compare my results to residential and protection of groundwater,
Okay. All right.
looking at the site uses, looking at the potential for impact, looking at the receptors.
And so there might be a site that is deemed appropriate for commercial use, but maybe not for a residential use with gardens, based on what's in the ground?
Yeah, if you're in a DEC cleanup program,
Mhm.
and they're looking at the use of your property, the surrounding area, and you're going to build a condo complex that covers the entire block with sidewalks,
Mhm.
that will definitely play in, and they'll say, meet this criteria with these controls at the site.
All right. Anything further on this first one?
That pretty much sums it up.
Okay.
For number 2.
Sorry, just, Mr. Taylor, do you have anything to add, or?
Well, I think I second his notion with the protection of, like, if you take the conservative approach, and then you cross-reference it with some of the other regulations, the new clean standard that DEC has adopted, clean, is if it meets the protection of groundwater and the residential soil cleanup objectives. So, yeah, you know, if you go with that conservative route, I agree with everything that Brian's saying, but, you know, if we wanted to go the extra route, and the data showed that it met those criteria anyway
Okay.
from the original. So I think that it's, you know, if we could err on the side of caution, go with the DEC's clean standard as unrestricted. It's gone out. That's no longer used.
Okay.
It's just it's impossible and with respect to some of the chemistry to achieve.
Right.
You know, there's background levels of DDT everywhere that do not meet.
Right. Like people's properties with gardens in them would not meet
Everybody's
unrestricted.
property. Like you
Okay.
can, if we soil sample for DDT, there's a chance it's going to be above 3.3 parts per billion. And DDD, the breakdown chemical. So that's why they're not using the unrestricted anymore, because it's just, it doesn't make sense.
Okay. So commercial site,
Commercial site, if we
SEO.
use, yeah, if we use the protection of groundwater and the residential soil cleanup, we're going well beyond.
Or if we want to take a more restricted approach, then maybe use restricted residential.
Right.
Okay.
And Chairman,
Yes.
could you just ask the consultants to address the possibility of having DEC weigh in on the appropriate standard?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that was the next,
That's number
Oh,
2.
that's number 2.
Okay. We'll get there. Like I said, we got the memo today. Any members of the planning board have any questions, comments so far based on our consultants? No, not yet. Okay. Let's go to number 2.
All right, number 2 is whether the consultation with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, SDEC, is necessary to determine the proper SEO. As I mentioned under number 1, this site is not in a state cleanup program, nor is it under the regulatory action of the state, and therefore, the state's not going to respond to that.
Okay.
They, you can contact the state,
Mhm.
and you can ask them questions, and they will speak theoretically, but they will not render any sort of specific decision as to whether it's the appropriate SEO for the site.
Okay. So you're saying even if we as a planning board authorize me to send a letter to the DEC in New Paltz or Albany, your years of experience tell you that either they wouldn't respond or their response would be, well, you're not in the program, so this doesn't apply.
Yeah, it would be, yeah, correct.
Okay.
It's, when you're in a program, they actually respond at very specific milestones.
Okay.
So, you can ask them if you think that your conceptual approach to investigate and clean up the site is appropriate, and they'll say you're going in the right direction, but you have to submit a formal plan, and then we will make a formal decision.
Okay.
So there are certain milestones, say a work plan approval, where you'll actually get a letter from the state that approves a work plan to investigate or a cleanup plan that would indicate the cleanup goal, like an SCO.
Okay. Mr. Taylor, anything to add there?
And I believe that that's the way that you're going to carry out your investigation moving forward, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, so he's going to follow the similar protocols that are outlined in the DER 10, which is the document that tells us how to investigate a site.
Okay.
So it's not going to be any different than Brownsfield. It's just they're not, the DEC won't weigh in.
Okay. So Attorney Polidoro, just having heard from these other consultants, the planning board, as written in the memo, the planning board may wish to reach out to the DEC. And
Yeah, I'm going to recommend, again, even though, we've all been advised and we all know that DEC won't comment on SCOs unless we're within the Brownfields program, I recommend that the planning board write to DEC, and we enclose a copy of the judge's letter, and we enclose a copy of this memo, and ask if they would weigh in this particular case.
Okay. All right. And just on the region versus central, New Paltz versus Albany, do you have an opinion as to which one makes more sense? I mean, you put in regional New York State DEC, so do you think that's the most appropriate approach?
Yeah, it goes both ways, like Albany's the
Sure.
central location, but
But Albany might say, well, you're in region, whatever region we're in, and New Paltz is the headquarters for there, so you should talk to them. Or
yeah,
Okay.
it's set up that way so they can, divest the
Right.
work appropriately.
And the New Paltz office might say, well, this is really important, so it's going to go to Albany. Like, it could go either way, is what you're
Yeah,
saying.
it's,
Okay.
they got a vested interest.
So send it to one of them, and it'll get figured out by the DEC. Okay,
Absolutely.
all right. Any members of the planning board have any comments, questions on that? Okay. Number 3,
Okay, well, I'll read number 3 and 4 together.
thank you.
They kind of go together. Whether the soil sampling locations and number of samples were sufficient,
Mhm.
and whether the groundwater sampling locations, number of samples, and constituents tested were sufficient.
Okay.
And I can refer to the November 1, 2023 package that was submitted by HB, the applicant, and
Mhm.
That included all of the environmental site assessments that were completed, which included a Phase 1, which identifies the historical uses of the site.
Mhm.
It looks at all of the available databases, and it also includes a site inspection. And you're completing it under the ASTM requirement at the time, which was ASTM. It was the 13 version. And then you identify recognized environmental conditions. And with those, you conclude as to what to do, which was to go out and collect more samples, or collect samples. And so for Phase 2, it was going out and investigating those 2 recognized environmental conditions, which was the, off the top of my head, I believe it was the underground storage tank, and also the former use of the property as an auto recycling yard, where there were piles of old auto equipment there. And then they completed an investigation, which included test pits, soil borings, well installations, collection of soil samples from the test pits, from the soil borings, and collection of a groundwater sample. And so, there are many factors that come into play when deciding where to sample, how deep to sample, how many samples, and what to analyze for. One thing, because I was able to walk the site today, and it's clear cut, so if I'm looking to say, I'm going to collect samples at a certain frequency,
Mhm.
going to a certain depth, or collecting so many types, I can definitely, I have the ability to move around more now.
Sure.
Like, there are restrictions before, like how the site was thickly wooded. So if you have to drive in machinery, you're not, I can walk there and say sample there, but maybe no one could get 10 feet or 15 feet from that spot before. So,
Right.
So on one hand, it might be hard for me to say, were enough samples drilled. But when you look at the prevailing regulations, like a DER 10, like Part 375, CP51, which are the things that tell us, how we're supposed to look at or investigate a location.
Hmm.
The plan that was applied is consistent with those regulations. There was a recognized condition, and they went right to those conditions. They collected the available media, soil and groundwater, and they had them analyzed. I know in the soil it was for the full Part 375 list. So everything that was analyzed for covered the full extent of that list.
Okay. And the potable water was sampled for VOCs, it says here? And there were no detections?
The potable water was they used an analysis for a drinking water well for VOCs, yes. And then
Okay.
the monitoring well, which is in the overburden water, which is different than the bedrock water.
Mhm.
And on this site, it was the only spot where overburden water was present.
Mhm.
The depth of bedrock is very shallow, and you would hit bedrock and everything would be so-called dry. There's moisture in soil, but
Mhm.
it's not saturated to a point where it would be considered some sort of aquifer. Water was not available to sample, except for that one location. And they analyzed that for the larger suite of compounds.
Okay.
And so, yeah, that's pretty much what's in the memo.
All right. And so just your review of it, in spite of that, we're still going to proceed with doing our own sampling,
Yeah,
just to
yes.
verify?
Yeah, verify, second check.
Okay. All right. All right. So on soil sampling locations and number of samples and constituents tested, Mr. Taylor, do you have anything to add at this time? Or?
No, I think it was all done properly. Part 375 is the suite of compounds that you want. It's very comprehensive.
Okay.
And if he's going to reiterate that investigation and then add on, then it's going to be that much more comprehensive.
And part of what we're going to discuss a little bit tonight is that you're going to collectively work on coming up with a scope of work for the sampling that will be done by AKRF or whomever AKRF is hiring to do the work,
Correct.
correct? And then we'll discuss that scope of work further in our meeting in 2 weeks. And then you'll be obviously reviewing everything that
Right.
takes place there. Okay, good.
Along with everything that's already been.
Right. Okay. Members of the planning board, any comments or questions about that? Okay. All right, number 5.
Yeah, that's whether the planning board should review the actual soil and groundwater testing data gathered by Transco's consultants.
Mhm.
The submission package delivered on November 1st, 2023, contained a complete set of data from all the previous ESAs, including full analytical backups with QA/QC packages.
Right. Okay.
So that's available.
Right, and so you would say that we should review it? Because the question is whether we should review it. Okay.
Yeah. It's there, go ahead.
It's there, we should.
Sure. All right, and then number 6, whether independent testing of soil and groundwater on project site is warranted. Basically the same as above.
Yeah, and we talk about that on next steps at the end when we wrap everything up.
Okay, good. All right, 5 and 6, any comments, questions? Nope. Okay. 7?
This is whether the testing done by Friends of the Great Swamp Frogs on its abutting property implicates the need for additional testing to determine if contamination on the Transco site is impacting the frogs parcel. And in looking at the data, I thought here was, as indicated by the DEC guidance documents, off-site sampling is conducted when I have a release of contamination. So the first place I'm going to look is right at that release points, the chance for the concentrations to be the highest. If I'm going to confirm that there's a release to soil, that's where I'm going to find it, the best chance. If it's not there,
You wouldn't expect it anywhere else?
Right.
Okay.
so you collect a sample there, throw in a couple other samples to check. And let's say I find a release of contamination at a fill port. Someone was filling a tank and it overflowed onto the ground. You collect a sample right there. A laboratory analysis identifies fuel oil compounds in that sample that exceed a soil cleanup objective that is comparable to the site. And then step out. Say you move a certain distance and you collect another sample, and you also collect it at a depth where you're covering the vertical and horizontal potential for that sample to
Because you're
move.
thinking three-dimensionally.
The plume.
Sure.
And let's say over that process you determine that the plume is, it went down 5 feet and then it went laterally 10 feet.
Mhm.
And 20 feet away, and with additional sampling, you confirm the nature and extent of that plume. At that point in time, there's no basis to then go 100 feet to say a property boundary.
Right.
Sample more. If with that sampling, the plume goes to the property boundary and it's exceeding a comparable soil cleanup objective at that property boundary,
Mhm.
along with the groundwater below it, if it exists, then the next logical step would be to go off-site
Off-
and sample.
Okay.
With the data presented, I could not confirm. In the data, there was no confirmation of a release, let alone...
In the frogs data
No, in the data for the site,
from Transco.
yeah.
Okay.
There's no confirmation of a release and a resulting plume, and so the chain is not connected, and therefore there's no basis for going off-site to sample.
Okay. But you're going to be doing your own sampling, and then you may or may not find contamination, and then if there is contamination, then you would do, as you said, follow the plume.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. And then if that plume is abutting the property, then it would make sense to continue beyond the property line.
Correct.
Okay. But if it's not abutting the property, then you don't see any reason professionally to go beyond the property line.
Professionally and also
Logically?
in accordance with state guidance.
Okay. All right. Mr. Taylor, you want to add anything to that?
No, I'm
You're with
in
it?
agreement,
Okay.
absolutely.
Members of the planning board, any comments, questions?
Nope.
Okay. And then number 8, whether additional testing of the frogs property is warranted to determine potential contamination mitigation through surface water with flow onto the frogs parcels. Essentially, the same thing as number 7 is what you're
That's
saying.
the same thing, and if another thing tying that together is understanding when you're looking at a site,
Mhm.
you're looking at all the potentials. Like a phase 1, you're looking at any potential for a release to the environment.
Mhm.
Phase 2, you're going to collect samples to determine whether a release occurred, and everything's done by a specific set of guidelines. So I would want to know. I would like to see some documentation if you'd want to try to connect detections from an adjacent property. I see the documentation of what was the methodology to collect that sample, the methodology you used to prepare the sample,
Mm.
to properly preserve the sample, to fill out the proper chain of custodies, all the QAQC items that we have to follow,
Okay.
so a result is defendable. And when you review all of that in a big package, if all that comes together to indicate that you have one big plume for a release area, then you can defend all that data.
Mhm.
Until that point, in looking at this comment, the only thing I can really comment on is the data that's been submitted, where it was done in accordance with all those requirements.
Okay.
Can I ask a
Yes,
question?
sure.
So, we did receive data from some of the neighbors, and you might not have had the methodology or the chain of custody or anything like that, but what does it mean if an adjacent property has some contamination, aluminum, high levels? Does it have any bearing on this property, or what could be rationales for that?
Well, it's very difficult to comment on sampling results without having any of the parameters around that. If you have contamination on an adjacent property that's confirmed to be to a release, my first question would be, what are the prior uses on the property? What has happened to cause that release? Where is the property located? Is it an old lead smelting factory in the middle of a city, or is it pristine nature preserve? Is it located next to a highway with diesel engines, or is it isolated to no public access or vehicle access? There's a lot that goes into that. Also looking at, like if you look at Part 375, which are in there is the soil cleanup objectives. Describes them and then has the specific criteria. And as what was mentioned earlier, like the unrestricted use criteria is sometimes impossible to meet because, take metals compounds for instance, they're naturally occurring at a lot of levels, and there was one metal, is it cadmium, or just off the top of my head, the SCO for unrestricted use is lower than the naturally occurring number as established by the Department of Health. So it's one of those things where the environmental professional then has to take into account, is it a background concentration due to a naturally occurring thing? Or was there a use here, like a battery factory, that could result in a release of cadmium? Aluminum is the most abundant metal on Earth. So I would be more surprised if you didn't find that compound. And so all of these things come into play when you're looking at characterizing a site, especially when it comes to doing it in accordance with all of the requirements of the state.
Okay. Mr. Taylor, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I've had the same experience. Chromium's another one. Chromium is in Westchester County specifically is generally found above the residential and protection of groundwater soil cleanup objective of 36, and unrestricted is 30. You'll find it often in the 40s, and that's naturally occurring. So yeah, metals, are found in soil naturally.
Sure.
It all depends on the parent material, meaning the bedrock, and what's in that formation. That's
Okay.
going to give it up to the soil. Inevitably, you're going to. So again, it's part of the process. So if you follow the process talks to these anomalies or naturally occurring metals.
Okay.
So if there's no identified contamination on Site A, but Site B is finding contamination, then the appropriate response would be for Site B to maybe do its own Phase 1?
No, do its own investigation to further identify, what the potential source is.
Right.
Or
And, again, it goes to there's a process, and then in that process, there's if I look at a data set that's 1 or 5 samples, but there's no context, then they really mean nothing. Where were they collected from? Why were they collected there?
You need to know where on the
Where's
site
that-
they
yeah,
were.
where, why,
Right.
where, how, when, all of the points that Brian had brought up.
And metals are unique because if you're collecting a water sample and that water has any turbidity in it, which is basically pieces of soil floating around,
Right.
The preservation process for a sample, aqueous sample that is going to be analyzed for metals is to use nitric acid. The nitric acid draws the metals into solution. So if you have a water sample that is cloudy, you literally could be detecting the metals in the soil and not the metals in the water. In essence, it's almost a soil sample.
Mhm.
So whatever's naturally occurring in that sediment is basically giving you a false positive of
For the water.
what's in the water. Yeah, the EPA has a guidance for collecting water samples, which includes, and it just takes a long time, so unfortunately I've had to go through this too many times, but out of a monitoring well,
Mhm.
you put your sampling pump down into the well. You pump at a very slow rate. And the whole point of this was EPA wanted to be able to get a water sample that could be tested for metals without filtration. It's hard to collect a water sample and have it be clear.
Mhm.
And so we install the wells in a very certain way, use this low flow methodology where you pump the water really slow.
Mhm.
Water goes through a flow-through cell that has a multi-parameter meter in it, and it's testing for oxidation reduction potential, pH, temperature, turbidity. And what you're doing is you're confirming that you're, in this case, a monitoring well sample, connected with the aquifer. By pumping really slow, the EPA guidance says below 50, but we like to get it below, even lower than that.
Mhm.
Just
The
to make s-
turbidity.
The turbidity, my bad.
That's, yeah,
thank
the
you.
cloudiness.
Sure.
Just to make sure it's the least cloudy as possible,
Right.
or you're gonna get metals that are not actually in the water.
They just came out of the soil. Okay. All right. So, any comments, questions on that? All right, so next steps. What do you see as the next steps here?
Well, as part of their submission, Transco included a scope of work to do an investigation.
Mhm.
They included, they maintain that, they conducted all previous investigations in accordance with the prevailing state requirements.
Mhm.
Used a SCO selection that was defendable based on the definitions provided in the state regulations.
Okay.
But in lieu of that, still willing to do an additional investigation, which included 12 soil borings, a collection of continuous soil samples to bedrock from those borings using a drilling machine to drill a core hole into the ground. And then the collection of the soil samples and groundwater samples from laboratory analysis. The groundwater sample would be existing well, and then also drilling, because there's no available overburden bedrock throughout a majority of the site. So you'd have to drill into the bedrock to encounter water-bearing fractures, actually hit the first aquifer that would be below the area
Right.
that's going to be sampled. And
Now, in doing that, what if there is contamination there? What are you potentially causing?
well, this kind of goes back to when it becomes time to follow your plume and sample to the end of it, which could be off-site. We typically do not like to go into the bedrock unless you have to.
Okay.
Because to drill into bedrock, it's solid rock, and this is dolomitic marble, so it's very hard. And you have to use specialized drilling equipment. And what was proposed was an air rotary rig. It's something, it's like a giant jackhammer. It smashes into the rock. You're going to keep going until you encounter a fracture that gives up water. Because these air rotaries can go up to 50,000 psi, so if you hit a water-bearing fracture, it's going to blow the water up. At that point, you can then pull the drilling equipment out and set up a well. But you've created a preferred pathway into the bedrock. So if you did have contaminants above in your overburden, unless you have to, it's usually not advisable to go into the bedrock because you're going to have a moment in time where you have that preferred pathway where contaminants can migrate.
Okay.
Even on a site like this, well, first of all, going back to the whole contaminant plume thing, if you collect samples and you don't find evidence of a release of contamination, or if you do find evidence of a release but it tapers off before it gets to the bedrock, there's no connection to the bedrock, then there's a defendable basis to say I'm not going to drill in that bedrock and create that
Yeah.
that temporary preferred pathway, which can become a permanent preferred pathway if you do not carefully construct your well properly and also abandon that borehole properly. So in lieu of finding any evidence of contamination, I personally would not recommend drilling into the bedrock.
Okay.
In accordance with the state standards for characterizing a site, if you find a scenario where you don't have an evidence of contamination and it has not, or there is and it has not, it's a confined migration area, that means that you've identified the full nature and extent. And so you would not go further.
Okay.
But yeah, as far as the plan, it's a great start, and at your request, the request of the board, I will use these recommendations to also put together a scope of work to complete an investigation and submit it for review.
Okay. All right. Mr. Taylor, anything further on that?
No?
No? Okay. Members of the planning board? No?
Yeah, I would agree.
Good.
Yeah, the bedrock is scary.
To just drill into the bedrock without a reason to drill
No,
into
just for no, again, following the process.
Right.
As Brian suggested, if we found that there is extensive contamination, and then you've got weathered bedrock,
Mhm.
that inevitably would allow that contamination to go into that weathered bedrock and then into a fissure, inevitably.
You're making a bad situation worse.
Correct, but currently, we don't have any evidence that shows that there's any contaminants that would warrant a bedrock well.
Okay. Thank you. Members of the planning board, any comments, questions on any of that? Okay. All right. So we're going to look to have you prepare and submit a scope of work. Is there anything further we want to discuss this evening, Planner Werner or Attorney Polidoro?
I think we got it covered.
Okay. Engineer Berger, anything you want to add? No, thank you. Okay. All right. So, yes, go ahead.
Take it back. I do have something I want you, if you're moving on to the next topic, the board would need a motion to authorize the chairman to send a letter to DEC, if you
Right.
do want to take that path.
Okay, good. All right, so let's go through, I guess, two things here. One, let's have a motion to authorize AKRF to prepare and submit a scope of work that will be reviewed by both the planning board and Mr. Taylor. Motion made by
So move.
Second. Member Bolano, seconded by Member Holmes. Okay, discussion? Any no discussion? I guess as part of that, we would need to ultimately, beyond the scope of work, you need to have Transco's, obviously, permission to be on their property, so I don't know if that needs to factor into this at
We
all.
would, the scope of work would be shared with Transco as well, and,
Mhm.
you know, they're free to submit thoughts or comments too, I would say, when the planning board and Scott review it
Mhm.
for access and other issues.
Right.
And then when it comes time to doing an investigation, we'd like to have just a written access agreement in place.
Right.
Lays out all the legalities of what we're going to be doing.
Okay. And in your scope of work, you would, I presume, say these are the things we're going to be looking for, right?
Yeah, be fully explained.
Okay.
The means and the measures and the methods.
And then, I mean, if we're sharing it with the applicant, the applicant might say, well, we don't want you to look for that, and you're going to say, too bad. I don't know that they will, but I just want to be clear that you're not
There's
going to
no
be.
sense in doing an
influenced.
investigation if they're going
Right.
to tell us what we can't look for.
Thank you.
Yeah, the easiest thing to do in my position is to say, these are the requirements.
Right.
This is what regulation says I have to do, and I'm
Okay.
not going to risk my license.
Okay. Thank you both. All right, so motion has been made and seconded. Any further discussion? Okay. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed say no. Okay, that motion passes 5-0 with 2 absences. Okay, so then, I guess motion to authorize the planning board chairperson to submit a letter to the DEC. Such a letter be written in consultation with our consultants. Motion made by
So moved.
Member Louverdeer, second by Member Holmes. Discussion?
Is there a timeline that we have to wait for DEC to respond? They're notoriously slow.
I'm sorry.
I don't know if we can, I don't know if we can motion, we can't motion the DEC to
Well, I'm
respond.
not saying motion to reply, but is there
I
a
think
certain
we-
point
we
where we
can
just say, they're not gonna?
Maybe part of the letter could be, we hope you would respond within 30 days.
You
or
know,
something.
please confirm receipt. of the
Yeah,
matter.
please confirm receipt is all we're going to get. And
Yeah.
that receipt is maybe all that we're going to get as far as a response.
Right.
But we should wait a reasonable amount of time. But I suspect that by the time the board approves the scope, and then the testing is actually done, and then the report is done, a reasonable period of time will have passed.
Right. And it
Yeah,
could be
and
that either we get no response, we get a response that says, yes, we received your letter, thank you, or it's, we received your letter and we don't respond to these, you know.
And maybe they'll say this.
That's what, again, we're all expecting, yes?
Let's say for some ungod known reason, they say, okay, well, you should choose these SEOs.
Mhm.
You know, it's just a matter of AKRF, you know, preparing the report
And then
and
applying
then,
that
and then
SEO.
referencing, you know, whatever SEOs that they decide are appropriate for the site.
Okay,
But
It's pretty simple.
what I heard tonight was that AKRF and Mr. Taylor were both recommending the more conservative SEOs anyways.
mhm. Okay. All right. Anything further on that motion? Okay, seeing nothing further, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed say no. Motion passes 5-0 with 2 absences. All right. Attorney Polidoro, anything further tonight, you think, with Transco?
Just so we're clear, the board will possibly be voting on the scope in 2 weeks?
Right,
Yes, okay.
which, just to be clear, we can't receive it on the 18th and vote on it on the 18th, so.
Sound like my boss.
Well, we are your boss.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, yes.
So, yes. Okay. So I think reasonably, you know, middle of next week or something. I mean, obviously you got to give time for, you know, Mr. Taylor to obviously review it. He might obviously have some feedback as a person who's peer reviewing what the work you're doing. So.
Try for even.
Try what? That sounds great. I mean, you can go now if you'd like to get started. No, anything further with respect to? Okay. All right. Okay. Any members of the planning board have anything further this evening with Transco? All right. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for coming out this evening. We're now moving on to appointment of planning board consultants and secretaries. We'll give the room a minute. In case anybody wants to get up.
Nice to meet you. See you in 2 weeks.
Okay. All right, so let's go through these. Resolution appointing attorneys to the planning board. Whereas pursuant to section 271, subsection 2 of the town law, the planning board is authorized to employ experts, clerks, and a secretary, and to provide for such other expenses as may be necessary and proper. Now therefore be it resolved that the planning board of the town of Dover does hereby appoint Rodenhausen, Shaw, and Polidoro LLP, Victoria L. Polidoro Esquire, as attorneys to the planning board for the year 2024, and authorizes the chair to execute the retainer agreement on file with the planning board. Should be secretary?
Doesn't matter.
Okay. This resolution is being offered by
So moved.
Member Lobadier, second by Member Holmes. Discussion? Seeing no discussion, resolution appointing attorneys to the planning board. Secretary, please call the roll.
Member Williams?
Aye.
Member Valano?
Aye.
Member LaRobier?
Aye.
Member Holmes?
Aye.
Chairman Corteen?
Aye. Resolution is adopted 5-0 with 2 absences. Resolution appointing a planning consultant to the planning board, whereas pursuant to section 271, subsection 2 of the town law, the planning board is authorized to employ experts, clerks, and a secretary, and provide for such and other expenses as may be necessary and proper. Now therefore be it resolved that the planning board of the town of Dover does hereby appoint AKRF Inc. as planners to the planning board for the year 2024, subject to the terms and conditions of AKRF's contract with the town of Dover. This resolution is being offered by
So moved.
Member Robadier,
Second.
second by Member Volano. Discussion? Seeing no discussion, resolution appointing a planning consultant to the planning board. Secretary, please call the roll.
Member Williams?
Aye.
Member Valano?
Aye.
Member LaRobier?
Aye.
Member Holmes?
Aye.
Chairman Corteen?
Aye. That resolution is adopted, 5-0 with 2 absences. Resolution appointing engineer to the planning board. Whereas pursuant to section 271, subsection 2 of the town law, the planning board is authorized to employ experts, clerks, and a secretary, and to provide for such other expenses as may be necessary and proper. Now therefore be it resolved that the planning board of the town of Dover does hereby appoint Berger Engineering and Surveying, Joseph Berger, LSPE, as engineers to the planning board for the year 2024, and authorizes the chair to execute the retainer agreement on file with the planning board clerk. This resolution is being offered by
So moved.
Member Villano, seconded by
Member
Member Williams. Discussion? Seeing no discussion, a resolution appointing engineer to the planning board. Secretary, please call the roll.
Member Williams?
Aye.
Member Valano?
Aye.
Member LaRobier?
Aye.
Member Holmes?
Aye.
Chairman Corteen?
Aye. Resolution is thereupon adopted, 5-0 with 2 absences. Resolution appointing secretary to the planning board. Whereas pursuant to section 271, subsection 2 of the town law, the planning board planning board is authorized to employ experts, clerks, and a secretary, and to provide for such other expenses as may be necessary and proper. And now therefore be it resolved that the planning board of the town of Dover does hereby appoint Marilyn Van Millen as secretary of the planning board for the year 2024. This resolution is being offered by
So moved.
Member Holmes, second by Member Villano. Discussion? Seeing no discussion, resolution appointing secretary of the planning board. Secretary, please call the roll.
Member Williams?
Aye.
Member Valano?
Aye.
Member LaRobier?
Aye.
Member Holmes?
Aye.
Chairman Corteen?
Aye. The resolution is thereupon adopted, 5-0 with 2 absences. Okay. A moment here. Okay. Here we go. Okay. All right, here's our calendar for, our proposed calendar for 2024. We're going to have planning board meetings. We're going to be generally scheduled for the first and third Mondays of each month, as they have been, with exceptions made for holidays. We will still have the deadline being the Wednesday, 19 days before each meeting, to give ourselves and consultants time to review materials as they come in. The only really notable exception is in January, because there's a holiday on the first Monday and the third Monday. We're going to have a meeting on January 22nd, the fourth Monday of the month. Otherwise, all the meetings are either the first or third or both of each month, again, except for when there are holidays. Does anybody have any comments, questions? This 23 needs to be 24. Any other comments or questions?
But there's no, excuse me, no more setup for election day because it's not here anymore? Or we don't
It is
know if
here, but it's not really much of a
here.
setup. It used to be a big, yeah.
It
Yeah,
used to be a big deal, though.
yeah. But now it's not as much, but there could be,
Okay.
especially with the presidential election.
It is a presidential election, yeah, that's true.
Yippee.
Yeah.
So it could be pretty busy. All right. That's a good point. Any other comments, questions? All right, so we're going to stick with not having a meeting November
Yeah.
4th, right? Okay. All right. Okay, so motion to adopt the Town of Dover Planning Board 2024 schedule. Motion made by Member Williams, seconded by Member Holmes. Further discussion? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed say no. Okay, that motion is passed. Vote of 5-0 with 2 absences. Okay, so our next scheduled meeting is December 18th, the deadline for which has already passed. We will continue to talk about New York Transco. We did receive a application, which we will begin to look at. And we will also discuss the site walks for Sherman Hill and anything else along those lines. Anything else?
That's it.
Yeah, that's it, right? Okay. All right. All right, any other business before the planning board? Okay, seeing no further business, I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Seconded by Member Villano. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye.
Aye.
Aye, we're adjourned.